Hi, I'm Christine Goodwin, and welcome to Lean Startup Methodologies, brought to you in partnership with Germana and Fred Exchange through the program Skill Up VA. We're going to talk today about what a startup is and how Lean will help you get one off the ground. So first things first, what is a startup? The thing you need to know that's most important is that a startup is not a smaller version of a big company. It is an entity that's trying to become a company operating under extreme uncertainty. No revenue, no defined value proposition, no determined product market fit, no determined problem solution fit, and in the mode of discovery, trying to determine who is going to buy what product that they can build. So what is Lean? We'll talk about the origins of Lean in just a minute, but Lean itself is a philosophy that came out of the Toyota production system, and in their words, it simply means this, that it's a production practice that considers the expenditure of resources for anything other than creating value for the end customer to be completely wasteful. And so what we want to do with Lean Startup Methodologies is give you tools that help you get your startup from ideation to a thriving company without waste and with maximizing resources at your disposal. So like I mentioned earlier, the origin of Lean Startup came from the marriage of two primary concepts. One in the manufacturing world from Toyota called the Toyota production system, which really sought to streamline their production process for making cars and putting those cars into a market that wanted to buy them, and not with waste. And then the agile development movement in the software world, which said, hey, how can we take software development, which historically had been this rather long process that was focused on things other than the user, and iterate in small batches to the delight of the customer because we're focusing on what they need. So when the Lean manufacturing methodology out of Toyota and the philosophy got married up with Agile from the software world, all of a sudden the startups had a toolkit that would help them go from that concept stage into a process, a scientific process for building to a company. So the process for Lean Startup got codified by primarily two people. Steve Blank, a professor at Stanford, who was also a serial entrepreneur, who started to notice certain patterns in companies that went from early stage to success. And a student of his, Eric Ries, who was also an entrepreneur, who audited his class, who had been a software engineer and was looking at his own startup and trying to figure out why things were starting to go badly, and realized that there was a disconnect between how they were approaching determining product market fit. So he wrote a book called Lean Startup, and Steve Blank had written a book called, well, he wrote two actually, the 4 Steps to the Epiphany and then the Startup Owner's Manual. And these became sort of the foundational basis for how you can go forward, taking that concept, running it through a very scientific process in small batches so that you can get to an end state where product market fit is determined before you go into the market. So how does it work? There are essentially 2 phases to a startup life cycle, and in those phases there are a couple of things that happen. The first phase is your search phase. So you're looking for customers and you're trying to validate with those customers that what you're wanting to put into the market is actually something that's going to solve a problem for them. When you can get customer validation on your concept, you're now ready to go develop that customer base and grow it. And when you get to a certain level of traction, and traction can mean a number of things, but in this case, let's say it means a number of users who are actively using your product, now you can start building a company. So why is it important? The hardest thing you can do when you're trying to get a startup off the ground is really figure out a formula for success. And a lot of times what this used to look like was a really lengthy business plan we spent a lot of time writing, laying out the entire premise and the vision of the company that we had in our head and what it would look like when it came into the real world. But the reality is, as Mike Tyson used to say, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. And as Steve Blank says, no business plan survives first contact with the customer. So what does that mean? It means that when you spend a lot of time thinking about the company you want to build and not actively searching in the world whether or not it's a company that's going to build a product that customers want to use, you're going to probably have some rather unpleasant experiences coming out of the gate. And so what we do with Lean Startup is we try to help you avoid what's known as a headshot. We don't want you spending a lot of time thinking on your own and writing on your own what your business is. We want you very quickly getting out into the world, getting out of the building, meeting potential customers and learning from them what it is you can do for them. When you do this before you start company building, you increase the likelihood that the product that you want to bring to the market or the service will be something that has a customer base that can't wait for it to hit the market. And if you can do that, what you end up creating is a successful business. So there are a lot of tools you can use as you go through this process. One of the tools that we like to use a lot is called the Lean Canvas. And the Lean Canvas is your business model, not your business plan. It's a one-page view of essentially your value proposition and your plan to get there. It has 9 core tenets, core blocks that you need to think about as you're going through this process of discovering who your customers are and validating with them your problem-solution fit or your product-market fit. And with the Lean Canvas, what we look at is really identifying and marrying up across those 9 blocks certain things. So for example, we will look to see who our customers are and what problems that we think are out there that are theirs, and then how many of those customers have that problem. And the solution that you think will solve that problem to them becomes a really interesting mapping between them, the problem, and what you're learning from them as you're iterating through this customer discovery process. When you can determine that the solution that you're putting in there for their problem is in fact a problem that is big and that your solution hits a major pain point for them, you've now defined your unique value proposition, and you have to do this with data. So we'll talk about metrics. So one of the things that you need to do up front in determining your unique value proposition is starting where it matters the most, which is who are your customers? How do you define them? How do you know they are going to be your customers? So you really need to think about what is a day in their life like? How old are they? Do they have a family? Do they work? What's their income? What do they do? How do they get through their day? And you have to put some thought into that. And when you do that, you start thinking about how that aligns or not with the solution that you've put in place for their problem. And when we talk about the unique value proposition, what we're really talking about here is that your customers feel, without a shadow of a doubt, the solution that you're proposing really improves their lives. So we're not just doing this to make money. We're doing this to help people by solving a pain point. And one of the ways that we can do this quickly is not build out a product with all these features, but to really think about what are the top 2 or 3 pain points. And given those, what are the first couple of things that we could build to test whether or not the solution we're thinking about will be something that the customer feels is important enough and solves their problems. So we've talked about some tools that Lean Startup can give you, Lean Canvas being the primary tool, but another thing that you can do very quickly to assess whether or not the solution that you're thinking about is a solution to a problem for customers is to build what's known as a minimally viable product. So minimally viable product isn't the full product because, again, we want to maximize resources and reduce waste. We don't want to do anything that isn't going to create value for the end customer. So in determining what our minimally viable product needs to be, we really need to get out there ahead of the gate and talk to these customers before we build anything to really figure out what is their biggest priority for pain getting solved and taken out of their lives. When we look at what we should build for an MVP, we need to build 1 or 2, maybe 3 little really small features, not a full-blown product. And we want to get that out into the market of early adopters or focus groups or however we want to bound that in a really small way first to get feedback. So we want to structure it so we can capture metrics. We want to know things like how many people are actually signing up, what's our activation rate, how many are converting to people to using these little features in a way that helps solve their problem. And we want to be able to capture this data with quantifiably, right? We don't want it to be just anecdotal, but we also do want to spend some time talking with these customers and really understanding how they're using that MVP. Because if the MVP isn't working to their end, we need to scrap it and start over. So the key thing about an MVP is that it's really small. It's not a full-blown product. We haven't spent a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of effort building it. But what we're doing is using it as a tool to validate an assumption about maybe 1 or 2 features that we think will help solve the customer's problem. And if it turns out that we missed the mark, which will happen a lot, it's okay because we haven't wasted a lot of our resources. So one of the things you have to think about when you're building this MVP and you're going through this customer discovery process and you're trying to validate whether or not the problem, solution fit, or the product market fit that you've envisioned is actually valid to an end user that's not your mom or your family member or your best friend, is to figure out with your MVP, how can you get it out to potential customers? So let's talk about some simple, sort of cheap, highly effective little ways. You can go to meetups where you think people who are going to need your solution are. You can talk with them in person. You can host a pizza party and invite a few potential customers in and really walk them through your MVP and give them surveys and ask them detailed questions and maybe even videotape them while you're talking to them and listen to the feedback that they give you and engage in a very personal way. You can use social media. Channels to customers are incredibly important. There's a lot of talk about how a solution should look and be and how that product needs to be. One of the little known nuggets that doesn't get talked about a lot when we're talking about startups is, what's the real deal? Well, the real deal ultimately is this. You can have the best product in the world, but if you don't have a good distribution channel to get that product out, you're not going to sell a lot of it. So we'd like to think about it this way, that especially in the beginning, and maybe all the way through to the end of this massively successful company that you're building, it's all about distribution. 80% distribution, 20% product, small iterative batches on that product. When we think about how we can determine with an MVP how we're doing, how do we measure what we're doing? How do we measure whether or not the assumptions that we built to in our MVP are actually valid for the customer? We need to think again about these key metrics. Part of those metrics can be collected from the channels that we use to distribute our MVP and to reach our customers. And by the same token, we also want to be looking at how are customers reaching out to us? How do they find us? How do they know where we are? And how can we instrument this entire process to capture information that says how many people came to see our site? Where were they coming from? Were they on mobile? Were they coming from the desktop? Which browser were they using? What's the demographic behind them? What do we know about their usage patterns and their patterns of activity with regards to the MVP that we've put out there? Do they tend to come from Facebook? Are they coming from Twitter? Do they engage with any of those platforms? And does that impact our thinking about the feature set that we need to release with the next iteration of the MVP? Customer validation is probably the biggest and most important aspect of the lean startup approach. Why? Because if we've done customer validation properly, what we'll end up with is traction. So what is traction? Traction is essentially users. And so one of the things we need to think about as we're going through our business model and on our lean canvas and really iterating through that with all this feedback and these little short bursts of releases of MVPs and collection of customer metrics to really understand where we're hitting the mark and where we aren't. One of the things that we really care about is how are we doing with our customers and how many of them are bringing new customers to us. Because what we get when we understand our traction and our ability to growth hack and grow our customers is what our revenue streams are. Sometimes we'll discover streams that we hadn't envisioned out of the gate. If we're using our lean canvas properly, then we can flip back and say, in the beginning we thought our revenue stream might have been a subscription-based model. What we've learned now is that customers would be more willing to pay for data as opposed to a subscription for a service. And this is important because as we go through the process of going from startup to company, we need to be able to mature the entire lean canvas so that we can marry our cost structure, how much does it cost us to build this product, to our revenue streams, because we'd like our revenue to be higher than our costs. But ultimately what we really need to make sure what we're doing is tracking with our value proposition. And again, traction is a good indicator that you've hit the product market fit just right. So just to recap, when we're looking at lean startup, we start by trying to figure out who are our customers. Are we solving their problem? How do we know they're solving their problem? How willing are they to continue to use what we've built? Where do we need to adjust? And then what can we do once we get that model right to grow, grow, grow? And when we've hit the mark with that, we're now ready to build a company.